Hello, everyone. I'm glad to introduce you to Curtis Yanko, who's going to speak about the software bill of materials, the SBOM. Take it away, Curtis.
Thanks, Zoe. Um, so I wanted to say, this is not strictly the Fed wants your SBOM talk, but it's based off of it and expanded from that talk that I gave on Bright Talk a little while ago. And that was really geared at a different audience, obviously impacted by this, but we'll certainly touch on it. But thanks everyone for having us, giving us a chance to share some knowledge about a topic that's been near and dear to my heart for a little while. So a little bit about me. After serving in the Navy, I came out and joined the rest of the world, and was in IT from the beginning. I worked for a CAD CAM company here in Connecticut in the early days, and was a guy that could put together computers and integrate. And then next thing you know, I found myself on the development team responsible for software configuration management and basically the delivery of the software. And my career kind of followed that for a long time. I worked with some Fortune 100 insurance companies where, again, I was the release engineer, application lifecycle management, kind of culminated in DevOps. And when in the DevOps world, and even in my early days of automated builds, I was always trying to get security involved. I knew that they had a need to run scans, and I thought it was something I could help them with, and it was something I was able to build that bridge on. And while working at Cigna, though, and this will come up in the talk, but we were trying to tackle this problem back in like 2014-ish, 2013, 2014. And so I got involved there and really kind of felt like it scratched the itch, as it were. And then I followed that over to the vendor side, and you'll see I worked with Sonatype, and now I'm with Grammatech. So I've been in IT for a really long time. I've been building and delivering software for a really long time. I've been less involved for a shorter time, but with partnering with security, and really have been involved with SBOMs since they began. So hopefully that means I have some perspectives worth sharing. Just a quick agenda after meeting with Guy. We did want to make sure, what is an SBOM and why, but then I'll do a little bit of that, the history of sort of kind of how we got here. We'll look at the use cases for SBOMs in the current setting. What are some of the current challenges we're up against? We'll touch on those regulatory requirements that I think are going to start a domino effect in the industry. So we're looking forward to that. And then also I'll just look ahead where it's going. And I'm really sorry to say, Steve's sick. Steve Spring is sick, and I was hoping he would be here today. I was going to try and get him involved, but we'll talk about the work he's involved with and the work that OWASP is doing. In my opinion, really leading the way on this front as well. So there's some good news in advance. Okay, so with that, what is an SBOM? And this is right off of like a CISA page, I think, the first bit. The quote, the software bill of materials has emerged as a key building block, right? I don't want to have to read it for you, but that's the sort of the text of it. And I added a key component of these things is they're machine readable. So we tend to see them in XML and JSON or something that's really easy to consume in an automated way. But what most people miss in that definition, and why I added this next bit, is it's also about provenance. And with that, I asked people if anyone remembers the recall of romaine lettuce of 2018. And the short story was there was an E. coli breakout. And because it was extremely hard for them to figure out who had what lettuce and where it came from, they had a hard time identifying the cause. And the industry had to throw out all the romaine. There was pretty much an order that says, unless you know exactly where you got it from, you probably have to throw this out. Before romaine could re-enter the market, they had to come up with some labeling. And so they voluntarily, it was very interesting because the FDA started providing some guidance and stuff, but they voluntarily just said, look, we're going to start to put a label on that makes it very clear which region this was produced in, and when it was harvested. And some of them even get more granular than these examples, and we'll go into which lots they came out of within the growing areas. And this obviously, so like I said, like it's not just, a lot of people like to say, hey, it's like a list of ingredients, but it's not enough to say I have lettuce, right? You have to know where that lettuce comes, and it's not even enough to say I have romaine lettuce, right? You have to then say I have romaine lettuce from Yuma, Arizona, because that's not, there may be a recall on the stuff coming from Salinas or somewhere else, but when that happens, you're going to want to be in a position to know. So think of it as a list of a list of ingredients, but where provenance is really important. The other popular metaphor is automobile industry, where they might source multiple suppliers, might make the same parts that go into cars, or even if it's one supplier out of different plants. When there's a recall, they'll know exactly which batch out of which plant and exactly what VIN numbers they went in. They can do very efficient recalls. And that's what we're looking for in our world, is that awareness. So when there's in our world, a recall is going to look like the Log4j event. And I'm going to mention that a few times. That's going to allow us to then react, right? To have that type of reaction where we can understand with great detail which manufacturers put which parts in which of our cars and what have we got to do about it, but in a software sense. So hopefully, and I just pause and make sure like everyone has a basic understanding of SBOMs at this point, because I don't want to go too far into it. It tends to focus on open source components. Commercial libraries could get in there. Obviously, other proprietary stuff tends not to be in these things. And we'll see through the history that it really has grown up around the idea of open source and understanding all these, sort of pre-built Lego blocks everyone's using, what's in your app, and then it helps, you will see later, to just understand if there's issues with it that maybe aren't associated with other things, that it would make it hard for you to know if you're impacted or not. But so when I go back, when I was working at my first insurance company here in Connecticut back around 2009, technically the official word was that OSS was banned. So I was working for a company called Uniprise at the time, which was supporting United Health Group. And the official company policy was it just wasn't allowed. Now, mind you, I was building Java applications for them, and we were using a ton of it. But it was a way to push down what I want to say, the legal exposure, right? So the senior leadership wanted to say, hey, we're saying you can't have this. If anybody does it, we can go fire the little guy and we'll limit our risk. And at the time, what was really holding everybody up was licensing. Open source licensing was really weird because was like vinegar and oil. Like you couldn't mix some of them, right? Or some could be mixed and others couldn't. And some said you had to do certain things and others said you could do whatever you want. And so that was really what scared people. Nobody really understood OSS licensing, and the lawyers took some time to catch up, and in the interim, they just basically banned it. The other technology at the time that was out there, and a vendor I'll mention, Black Duck, was in the game, and another one, Palomino. But they were really code snippet scanners, and they were looking for copy pasted code bits from open source projects that might violate those licensing issues, right? So the industry at this time isn't really interested in SBOMs, but they were sort of interested in, are people copy pasting stuff, and is open source code found its way into my IP, and therefore maybe it's in jeopardy. Tools like this were used largely in M&A activities. It was a no-brainer. You pay Black Duck a bunch of money, you scan megabytes of code, produce pounds and pounds and pounds of reports, and then go beat up the company you were buying on the price, because you would say, oh, well, this IP isn't yours, and this you've got all this other stuff, and right, and so they would just offset the cost of doing all the scans by beating them up on the price. One of my old coworkers at Sonatype, he sold his company to IBM. He had 5 products, and when at the end of the deal, he was only able to sell 3 of them because his own stuff had been polluted with open source that affected his intellectual property. And so it effectively wasn't his, and he couldn't sell it. But this was also the very first time, right around this time, the FBI started a work group working with financial services and really starting to pay attention to vulnerabilities in open source. And it was the first time in my career working at Uniprise that someone from security came and visited me and said, hey, do you know anybody that's using, I want to say it's Spring. Tried to Google this and look it up. It's hard to piece the story back together. but I'm pretty sure it was the Spring Framework, and they were going around asking everyone if they were using it because the FBI sent a letter to United Health Group saying, hey, if you got this stuff in, it really has this really nasty problem that people are taking advantage of, and you're going to want to be aware of it and, put up some controls or patch it or all of that. And it was the very first time I'd ever heard from security in this regard. Initially, it was just the lawyers and the licensing. We fast forward to 2013. Now I'm working at another insurance company here in Connecticut, Cigna, and um, I mean, there's someone in the waiting room. I don't know who else sees that, but I'll let them in. And what I was doing here was we were really looking at the focus on time to market. And as a company, we were wrestling with how do we enable our developers to use open source. And because the reason is like we knew the benefits, but we also knew that we had legal obligations that we had to define what licenses were okay. We had to maybe to some extent suggest certain frameworks over others, stuff like that, right? So we had a mixture of enterprise architecture, AppSec, and myself and legal formed up an OSS governance team. And our charter was to figure out how to enable our developers and then enter Sonatype. They had this pre-market offering called Component Lifecycle Manager, CLM, and they actually came to me trying to sell me an update to the repository. And I said, my repository is fine. I've got this real problem with open source. And they're like, wait, if you sign this NDA, we'll bring you into this program and you can help us bring this new product to market. So I got involved with them early. And this was just a big game changer for us because it just allowed us to bake this in and get in front of all the barriers to just letting our developers adopt using open source, right? So that we had immediate feedback on that it wasn't vulnerable and that the licensing was okay. And if it was, the developers were getting that feedback daily and had an opportunity to fix it before the end of their sprints, right? And I'm also part of an emerging DevOps group about this time. So we're really focused on velocity. And this was a key piece to that to make sure that we were, from an audit and compliance perspective, doing the things we needed to do instead of just letting them go willy-nilly. All right. 2021. So we're coming up on the anniversary. We got I think we got a week or so, because I think it wasn't until like the 23rd of Log4j. So I'm sure everyone remembers that from last year. What made it so interesting was that it was so trivial to exploit and it was actively being exploited that everybody kind of assumed they were being exploited. And so whole security teams were pulled in off of their vacation during the holidays, during the Christmas holidays here in the US. And that wasn't good. And they spent a week just doing discovery. They spent a lot of time trying to figure out where this is. Now, some of the more mature teams had this, like we did at Cigna. They had this in their factories, and they could answer about the stuff they had produced. But it was also the tipping point of when this tipped into third-party risk management. People started asking about, well, what about all the other software that we're deploying? What if it has Log4j? How do we get our various vendors to attest to whether or not it has an issue? And they had no visibility at all, other than endpoint scanning. And I'm sure Nessus came up with some rules that could maybe spot the file, but maybe not so well if it was in some way embedded or something, right? Not long behind that, the EO comes out, right? This has become a national conversation now. Log4j was arguably the straw that broke the back, or maybe it was already broken and it just, the wheels of bureaucracy took some time. But the executive order comes out. We got the OMB directive earlier this year, and now the feds are starting to say, hey, you have to do this stuff. It's too risky for us. And, we can't just keep consuming software without a good understanding of what's in it. And so they're starting to mandate that. We'll take a closer look at that mandate and the timeframes a little later. So back into the anatomy of an SBOM, so again, a little bit back into what makes up an SBOM beyond just the list of ingredients. This is a little bit more detail. It's worth mentioning the BOM metadata. So that's just sort of who and what phase of the cycle was it developed, produced, is it being created in? who and how, right? That kind of information, and that can become important around for people familiar with like JavaScript. If I derive the whole thing by looking at package lock JSON, okay, that does tell me all the things it asks for, but maybe without a scan or any other type of analysis, it may be limited in its view. It might be blind to some things. Then there's the component information itself. And then the Cyclone DX goes on to do like dependency relationships, compositions. This is work coming out of the OWASP and Steve. I'm drawn to the Cyclone DX personally, just because I think it's very comprehensive and I think it's very forward looking. And and I have conversations with Steve all the time, so I know how and I've been having him for a while now, and I know how deep into this he is. SPDX is another popular format. It's been out much longer. It originated as a way back when everyone was afraid of licensing. This was how you provided an SBOM that just focused on licensing. There was no other. It was just literally like, here's what's in our software and here's how it's licensed, and that was the focus. It's since been expanded to take on additional information around expressing vulnerabilities and other stuff. So now let's talk a little bit about the use cases. Now that so we see how we got here. Now we're here, and I break them down into two primary use cases, which is the producers and the consumers. Right? Obviously, the producers are like when I was running a DevOps software factory, but I also had other folks at Cigna that were responsible for bringing in open source databases. Adobe Reader was on everybody's desktop. Just all sorts of stuff that we were buying, or if it was free or bought, it didn't matter, but there was a lot of stuff that was deployed on the desktop and in the data center. And this use case was the first, and this is where Sonatype stepped in, and it was around the time of the rise of DevOps, and the early focus was on accelerating software development. It was all part of the shift left movement that said, if I could give your developers feedback about the components that they're using as a part of their every build, as a part of their daily activity, that would give them the opportunity to be aware that some of these components are old, known vulnerable, maybe have licenses that run afoul of your company's policies, right? So that was the first use case, is to do scans in that build process, provide that feedback, and the classic, we're going to test early, get all the defects out, and move it down. And it speeds things up, and it then lowers your cost because you're spending less energy in rework and fixing after the fact. This also went hand in hand with our need for security and compliance and audit, right? We had an obligation to be able to tell these people, here's how we are vetting all of this stuff as we're using it, as it goes in. And then also, here's our vuln management program for after it's been out, that as we learn what's in our software and has now gone bad, how we're fixing it, right? So all of that was central to this, even though the most obvious benefit was to the developers themselves. Obviously, the organization felt it had a much better posture. And it also can really help with your relationship with your customers. I've had people come to me in the past asking for solutions like this because their customers were reporting problems in their software to them, right? And you don't want your customers doing a scan and saying, hey, you have this old struts library in here, or whatever that is, right? And so some of the companies like that started saying, hey, we got to get it in our factory so that we can get in front of them. We need to be proactive to them and not look like we're unaware and reactionary, right? So I would encourage everyone to be asking for these when you're buying software, and and any vendor that can provide one. I think it builds trust and confidence that they have control of their process to the point that they can tell you all the things that went into it, that you're taking into your organization. That gives you that visibility and awareness to have an understanding of that. Now, the next use case is what we call a third-party SBOM. So this is for the consumers, right? So this is I just bought Adobe Reader, and they haven't provided me an SBOM, or if they have, we'll cover both. What am I going to do here? And the first thing is obviously just visibility, right? It's basically a black box. They didn't give you an SBOM, so we're going to shine a light in there and try and tease out what's in it, so you can have some sense of what kind of risk might be hidden in there. so that you can start to make these assessments. And I'm talking to folks now that are doing this sort of after procurement, but similarly, they want to move this into their procurement process and make it part of the scoring up front. Even like if we have multiple vendors in play, the vendors that can provide an SBOM are going to have a leg up in winning that deal, right? So, but even if they do provide an SBOM, and this is where I deal with some folks in, let's just say, the government and military and three-letter agencies. They want to verify and validate everything. They don't care if they got an SBOM or not. They want to do multiple independent scans to make sure nothing is missing, right? To make sure it found everything, to sort of just get a sense that, yeah, that they're not lying to me. But also, one thing that's come out is these type of scanners do have the added benefit of often being able to find things like an OpenSSL or Codex that are embedded in other libraries, and it might not be obvious, right? And so this type of scanning can unearth those kinds of hidden dependencies that may well be missing from even a very mature producer who's given you an SBOM right out of their CI/CD process. Or they maybe have a sense like, yeah, it uses an OpenSSL, but they don't know what version of OpenSSL or what version of FFmpeg, right? So that's where this is a nice addition, even if you have an SBOM, because not only can we sort of basically do a sniff test on what they told us, it can really potentially uncover some additional hidden risk, and it's not really because the producer did anything wrong. It just sort of the way our systems work right now, the visibility sort of ends at some open source component. The other thing is, I mentioned this before, Log4j. When you're doing this, when you're building up this, gaining this visibility, you're building an inventory, right? And we all know that inventory is that first column on our 5x5 matrix, if you subscribe to such a thing. And it's the basics, right? It's the part that we have to be excellent on, because nothing to the right of that in the grid is going to happen if I don't have it in my inventory. And so I think when third-party risk management kind of got caught unprepared last year with Log4j, we're having a lot of those conversations with those folks to avoid that, right? They, instead of coming in and spending the whole team, spending a week and hundreds of person hours just to get through the discovery to then even begin to assess the impact and or remediation, they want to have the ability to come in and do a quick query that says, okay, here's everywhere Log4j is, not only in the things that we built, but also in the things that we consume, right? So, and get through that MTTD really quickly, so they can move really quickly to MTTR, right? Get the impact done, move on to remediation. And it's also, again, here, security and compliance. A lot of the folks I'm talking to have a lot of reason, like if an SBOM isn't, even if it was provided, but especially when it's not, they're going to do these types of scans. They're going to go through and really vet and make sure we understand what's in it for their own regulatory compliance or government or whatever it is. So it works there as well. All right, so let's move on. Now that we've sort of gone through the use cases, we now have a sense of why an SBOM and what benefits it gives to me. Then the next question starts to become, what are some of the barriers to adoption? Like why aren't we doing it? And I want to lead with, I have this as my naming things. This is stuff Steve and I worked on in an SBOM forum. We could talk about that here in a minute. But the other one is the vendors themselves. The first biggest one is the vendors they don't want to share their SBOMs, right? They never have. And I'm reminded that our industry was shaped by vendors who sued ethical hackers for trying to report potential weaknesses in their software, and they would sue them and steal their computers and really try to make their life miserable for really just trying to help Oracle out or whoever that was. And when I throw out names, I'm not picking on anyone. I'm just trying to throw out household names. But the bigger vendors in particular were not happy with this and really created the environment of maintaining that secrecy and sort of forcing all the vulnerabilities into a black market situation. The other thing that comes up is this naming of things. If any of you have worked with the NVD, you're probably aware that there's several limitations. I could, using my own examples, if I had some library that had OpenSSL in it, if that's not well known, then some CPE for OpenSSL that's known vulnerable may not make its way to that component, right? It just may not. So that's what happens is these things get reported in some place, but then its ability to proliferate to all the places where that's consumed is often limited. And then on top of that, then there's, things aren't fully reported all the time. They get reserved, but then not updated. There's other issues there with just getting the information in there. And something that we worked on with Steve as a member of the OWASP, along with just this cross-functional community of folks that goes by the generic name of the SBOM forum. And it's really just a meeting like this every week where we decide a problem we're going to solve and then work on it for months and months and months and publish a paper of recommendation. So we published this paper talking about the naming of things, and the TLDR on this is Perl, which is another Steve sort of imagination with his work with us at Sonatype, and kind of extending on what Maven was doing to come up with a uniform package, a package uniform resource locator, so we can know not only what version it is, but back to my earlier lettuce story, which repo it came from, which foundry, which ecosystem, right? So again, they're not all equally safe or vulnerable. We need that extra layer, just like we needed it in lettuce to know if I had a real problem. And so they came up with that. Our timing was really good because we're publishing this recommendation, but a lot of the certified naming authorities are already using Perl, but they had no way to pass it to the NVD. And so this forum seems to be connected to just about everyone, everywhere in some way. And so we were able to get in a pull request up on the CVE JSON project, which is what they use to ingest vulnerabilities, and get Perl added to the 5.1 spec, which is not out, and I don't know when it's coming out. You go to the project like I show here, the milestones, and you could see how they're progressing towards this release. I don't know that it should be not too far away, but I don't know that it's going to happen any day now either. I mean, it might be early next year. So that was that. So these are just, so between the vendors not wanting to cooperate and an ecosystem that makes it hard to map all these things, all of these things then conspire to maybe not even necessarily a barrier to adoption, but then realizing the full value. You could adopt SBOMs, but if these things aren't mapping, you're going to be unaware of maybe a vulnerability related to something that you're working with, right? So it starts to minimize its efficacy, if nothing else. Oh, I mentioned here vendors on this one. Okay. The other thing is, AppSec is really focused on identifying and communicating risk. And at least in my third-party SBOM work, and even in the factory, most people see this as, oh my God, it's just going to generate a ton of CVEs. And the last thing I need is another 1,000 CVEs because I've already got 20,000 CVEs, right? And I quote my friend Kevin Green's hashtag on LinkedIn every time he talks about this. He always throws in a little, don't bug me to death. And he's always, I don't need another tool to tell me more CVEs. So I think that puts people off because that's how they frame it. They think like this is I'm going to identify components. I'm going to then be able to identify known vulnerabilities. Then the question becomes, now what? And obviously in the case of a vendor, you're limited. You're limited in what you can do with that information other than work with them, right? So it's less about the CVEs and I think much more about just preparing for that event because that was really, the big impact and really where a lot of waste happened. Whereas we're not going to try and manage this like we manage other CVEs. And we'll see there's some other technologies coming along that are going to help us reduce those and allow the vendors to tell us which ones are really pose risk and which ones don't, which is also why the CVEs I think are not what most people think, right? Like most people think this is the real reason to do this. I'm here to tell you it's really not. It's really more for Log4j type events. It's really more for the big stuff. unless you're in the military and the government and they're actually like blocking its ability to go somewhere. And that's a little bit more upfront. It's going to be a combination of stuff. And they're just looking really deep at everything that's in it and making sure it can go on a secure network in like the intelligence community or the military, right? So they have a different bar. So to me, it's much more about getting this inventory. But even that's hard because the vendors don't want to tell us, again, back to bullet one. And the idea of scanning everything doesn't sound exactly appealing either. But it becomes I think a necessary evil in this case, because without that inventory, like I said, nothing to the right in that matrix is going to work for us. So when there's that announcement again, we're not going to be able to look it up, right? And so back to the CVEs a little bit, just because an app uses it doesn't mean it's vulnerable. That's why I really don't want to focus there. I think the direction of this is really about establishing a better way to communicate with our vendors, better than even vulnerability disclosure reports and stuff like that. And really, where we're really going here, the last final challenge here, like I said with the scanning, is the sheer volume, variety, and velocity of all of this that we know in all of our facets of IT. Commercial off-the-shelf software, open source software, all of it is evolving every day. We're constantly consuming it. We're constantly rolling it out. We're constantly updating it. So there's just real challenges in the sheer scope and scale of the challenge that are going to, that pose some issues. Obviously, automation comes to mind with stuff like that, right? It's going to be really important to automate so that we can deal with those things. So now I do want to take a minute and talk about the OWASP tools. I just quickly threw this slide together. I apologize, but this is really, I've already said Cyclone DX, I think, is very comprehensive and very forward looking. They've also, they've been involved in the healthcare, what would they call it? It was like a proof of concept, right? Where they got people involved and using it and got feedback. And so there's a lot of different verticals that have some different views on it than maybe anyone here does. Where, so if in your job, you probably bring a certain set of blinders to what SBOMs means for you. But when you move across different verticals, it can take on new meanings. And as a result, I think Cyclone DX has done the best job to date of just being very comprehensive, very forward-looking, very inclusive of all of that. Now, it also makes it a little bit daunting. There's kind of a lot going on in it. And again, I wish Steve was here. So DepTrack is an OWASP-produced tool. Steve's been deeply involved with it. I think, it's free. It's fantastic. You can import your SBOMs. You can bring stuff in there. You can get your inventory. You can do your queries. You can look up your vulns. And also, it's already being built for the future. And I'm going to talk about here a little bit in terms of automation around SBOM APIs, which is some more forward-thinking activity coming out of OWASP, which is how do we deal with that volume and variety, not just in like getting our inventory, but now when there's that log4j event, I've got to talk to hundreds of vendors and quickly get some kind of assessment back from them, like some kind of read. That has to be automated as well, right? We can't send 1,000 emails or go to their support sites and open tickets. We need something much more nimble. And so DepTrack does all the things you would expect it to do today. And it's already really planning for the future. There's some stats out there, and I don't want to misquote it, but I'll get it from Steve, but they use OSS Index as a backend, and OSS Index reports that DepTrack is looking up like tens of millions of components every day, for people that have deployed this, managing their SBOMs in there and using OSS Index as one of their backend data feeds. So it's a tool that I feel nobody talks about, but it's apparently seeing a lot of adoption if we're to believe the lookup metrics. All right. So the emerging stuff, this for a lot of us feels, I mentioned those, the vendors and stuff earlier as being one of the biggest barriers to all of this. But we're, with not only the federal government, so not only the executive order and the OMB, but we're just seeing a lot of pressure from a lot of other spaces as well, in terms of making sure, recommending, or pushing towards, so including like the FDA around medical devices. I'm working with a national certifying lab who wants to do this for IoT and all the, this, we're going to get, we're getting flooded with already all these types of things. I've got a thermostat on the internet. I've got my bulbs have Wi-Fi and firmware in them, my light bulbs. All that stuff needs this same kind of rigor to get those sort of. So we're starting to see in a lot of different places a real escalation in the need and starting to demand, or at least have some mechanism by which we can expose SBOMs for everything coming through the pipeline to get those certifications, to get approved, to meet pre-market conditions so they can go to sell. And these things, obviously, when you start to put something between a medical device manufacturer and their ability to get that in the hands of their customers, they're probably going to take it seriously and start to work on it because they don't want to get it there and have to spend a bunch of time trying to cobble something together while this thing's not going to market. So I do feel like a lot of these things are conspiring to start the dominoes falling on the producer side to start producing SBOMs and making them readily available. Now, I don't believe that they're all going to do it anytime soon, but if I swear like less than 10% do it now, and I'm hoping, in a few years we're getting to that 70 or 80% where it's starting to feel reasonable. Right. But so we'll see how it goes. The executive order, the OMB memo itself is actually, I thought it was a big letdown. You might have heard me talk about this before, mostly because it's really asking for self-attestation that you're following the NIST framework, which does include using things like SBOMs, but it doesn't require them. It actually just says you shall, you may ask for them, you may ask for a static analysis. It doesn't put a hard requirement on it, but there is some federal, I don't have it on here, but there's a House resolution that does I think it's basically the military spending for the year. And it has a clause in it talking about software contracts and requiring a software bill of material. So without that, right now, it's up to each and every agency and each and every group to decide how critical things are and whether or not they want to ask for one. But by tying it to funding with the House resolution, it may simply be as a matter of compliance for them that they're going to have one before they can purchase something. Something that we at Grammatech are running into firsthand. Thankfully, this is what we do. So we're in a position to do that. There's a lot of dates on here. It's typical government. There's basically, they've got up to a year before everyone has to get on board, and it sort of phases in over time. We're still even waiting. I think in January, there should be a template on how to even produce a self-attestation. That's not even out there yet, just to give you an idea. But it just feels like, and again, I don't think it's the EO that did it. I just think it's everything that's happening in the world. And we're seeing lots of separate, areas of industries and the government starting to really pay more attention to this. And it's all been further exacerbated by physical supply chains and COVID, right? So supply chains is just everywhere right now for all of us because it's had such a big impact on our lives over the last couple of years. You can't get stuff to remodel your house or, what's in your software. It seems like I can't get away from it, my personal life or my professional life. So in terms of where this is going, if I allow myself to sort of look out at the horizon, I just met with my engineering team yesterday, and I'll share with you what I shared with them. So these are some Gartner quotes. That's, it's typical Gartner. By this year, all your friends are going to be doing this kind of stuff. But for me, I just look at it as they're coming, right? We've seen between the regulatory requirements and the government and that stuff and certification labs and the FDA, it's coming. So, the thing for me is, how are we going to deal with it when they do come, when we now have thousands of these to manage as well? And again, I hinted at this before. This is where this idea of an SBOM API, which has sort of been championed by a couple different voices in the community for a while, but I think it's being made real by the OWASP community and Steve. In terms of these, if DepTrack itself would have an API and it could either reach out to someone else's depth track or anything that had this API and query it to say, hey, get me the latest Vex file, get me the latest information on this, and let me know, which of those vulnerabilities you've already said don't present a threat. And now my list of, of vulns goes from thousands to a handful, hopefully, or maybe even just one, right? So it allows for that communication bit for this next event for us to be able to query all of our vendors and get that rapid response, get through that MTTD and move on to the remediation. So I mean, on one hand, they're coming. Even if you have one, there's a need to verify and validate them. We're going to have a need to start managing them. We know their benefits in terms of our ability to at least have awareness and respond to compelling events. And then the real future, though, is to me, it's just all the communication. How are we going to constantly share this back and forth? It's not clear to me how that's going to work, but I don't know if Adobe's going to give you a login credential that says, hey, you have access to our SBOMs, because I don't think they want it public, right? But they're going to have to find some balance and let you, every time you roll out a new version, you could pull down, maybe delete the version you had and pull down the new version. But also when there's that compelling event, now we can get deeper into it. We can use this Vex report that then adjudicates which of the identified vulnerabilities present real risk or not, which then winnows that down. And that's starting to sound to me like something that we could, a process that would be sane, right? Like it wouldn't require everybody to come in. It wouldn't require endpoint scan everything and then sift through the reports and then go talk to people and figure out, why is this file on this server that's attached to this product that has nothing to do with it? and does it present risk, right? So there's all of that. That's it. I thought I had a slide on the Vex. I apologize on that. This deck's evolving. I've hinted at it a couple times, but that's another, depending on who you ask, though, Vex is in theory a great idea. The working groups working on it are really bogged down in how to enable it. So it's a fantastic idea, and at the same time, it's sort of going nowhere at the moment. But it's moving in. My SBOM forum. I also sit on the CISA forums and all that kind of stuff. It's being talked about a lot because people understand the nature of the problem that I just described is coming at us and understand the need for it. So I think we'll be able to get out of our own way eventually. But usually initially, I think it's just too many cooks in the kitchen right now, and it's hard to get anything done on Vex. But again, OWASP is leading the way with actual implementations, a couple different ones, different ways to do it, embedded in an SBOM, separate from an SBOM, separately linked to an SBOM. So again, I see Steve and OWASP doing some very forward-thinking work in this space, even though the rest of the community is really struggling with what's that going to look like, right? So OWASP and Steve aren't waiting, and the rest of us aren't waiting, and we're doing stuff, and we're going to learn from it. So it's not going to be perfect, but we'll get it. People will start doing this stuff, and the more we do, the more we learn. And so with that, I'll turn it over to any questions. I can't see any. Oh, I see something. Oh, that's just Zoe, right?
Well, I do have some questions.
All right.
So, do you foresee in the near future companies asking for SBOMs when they purchase products in their SLAs?
Yes. I mean, it's already happening and not enough. And if you leave this meeting with only one piece of advice, go to your third-party risk management people and tell them to add one row to their 200-line security survey and ask for an SBOM. Just ask. If you don't ask, they're not going to feel compelled to provide one. We all have to start asking. But it is happening. Okay. I'm talking to folks that are doing it. They're asking everyone. They're not getting very many of them. But I think that'll change.
What is the level of effort to manage an SBOM? What's the who are the people usually working with the SBOMs? Or what group of people? Is it DevSecOps, SecOps, Dev team? Are people putting it in
Yeah.
in their life cycle as they develop, and have a running list as they develop as a side set? You know,
Yeah, and what we're seeing, so the current CISA SBOM work group is focused on a paper that's going to talk about all the different times at which an SBOM could be created and what value it brings. And just to highlight the range, even as early as just ideation and design. So before we've coded a line, if we want to start thinking about what database might we want to use, what frameworks might we want to use, and starting to vet it out that early to say, like, are these a fit? Like, does this make sense as a stack? What's their MTTR? What's their licensing like? Did I just freeze up? Please tell me I don't. Oh, no. Yeah, we're good. For a second, I thought the whole thing came to a stop. So that's one example, but I also talked about the developers, right? As a DevOps feedback tool, here's what you're using, here's what we know about it. Maybe someone goes in and adds a new dependency, they run it through the build, and they realize, like, oh, wow, that's the license I'm not allowed to use. I'm going to have to find a different component. Or it has a vulnerability, and it turns out I saw that in another project and just copy pasted in the version information into this one, and it's just old, and maybe I just got to update it, right? So there's that case too. But then you get down to the operations end and third-party risk management. How are we responding to the Log4j type events, right? So I see it's across the whole life cycle, and everybody that touches it throughout with different, just a slightly different lens in each context.
could you possibly show us an example of what your
Uh, uh,
reports look like? Is it an easy thing, or is it complicated? I didn't ask you for that.
um,
I'm putting you on
Tell
the
you what, I don't
realize.
want to show our thing, but what I will show you. Let me see if I can. Am I going to find this real quick? And I think this is an OWASP project.
That's great. Yep, excellent.
So this is a really great repository. It's talking. You start to see this is the other conversation: SaaS bombs versus O bombs versus H bombs versus, like, the bombs are exploding, right? Like, there's more bombs than we know what to do with, and Vex. Just for sake of argument, let's just stay focused here. Uh, Here's a handful of apps that they've chosen to do something for, and I can open this up. Or did it not open for me? What
You got to
happened?
download to the
Did it
right.
download it? I thought it was just gonna open in a. I'm sorry. Why am I?
I think you got to
Oh no,
download
view raw. There it is. I'm
up view
sorry.
raw. Okay.
All right, here we go. So it's machine readable, but this is kind of, it's basically, there's a hierarchy here. It should start up top that this was Cyclone DX version 1.2. It is serialized. This is a uniquely identified SBOM. It's the first version of this SBOM. When it was made, this was made by the Cyclone DX Maven plugin, so we know how the means. And you start to get into, so these, the tools, and after the metadata, and then we get into the components. We're looking at key, and then start to get into what's in those, right? So you can see here's Bouncy Castle, and you can see full, this is a package URL, right? It's in the Maven ecosystem. It's this one of the Maven ecosystem and Central. It goes on to versions, all the modifiers, right? If it's different architectures, a little more metadata that this is a library, and it just continues to drill on all the hashes, right? All the hashes, CPE, pearls, all the stuff that you need to compute. But in here, we're starting to get some insights into what it is I have, what version, what Cyclone DX was used. I've started. Oh, this is good. These are kicking in. Yesterday, when I was in my office, I started writing policies in there. So there's a policy engine. I wrote we can take a quick look at those, but I have policies like I'm looking for a version range of Log4j and a couple of license types. It's really it would depend on your use case, what policies would make sense for you. I just wanted these to light up. I'm trying to just use the tool for what it is. We get a breakdown on the vulnerabilities here. We can drill into them. We can go see all the components. And actually, this one is not one I want to do. Let's look at like this one, right? And so this is a fantastic tool. And there's even little hints in here like that's the latest version, right? So that's good. Thankfully, it doesn't have any problems with it. But all these yellow ones, there's newer versions, right? So all these little hints in here to help manage these things. And then you can start to do whole dependencies. I think I did one from the SBOM. This sample app is from the SBOM, the Swift bomb generator. It's a website. And this is when you start doing mapping. So this is really a container that's running Windows, SQL Server, regular Windows, and then Tomcat and Spring on Java 1.8, right? So here's the JRE, here's the stuff running on top of it, and here's all the rest of the system. So now you're starting to see where we can get complex in the context of a container or a piece of hardware. We can map everything that's on it, right? And start to do that. And then of course we can come in here and we can start to say, is log4j in here? And I think in this one it's not, but you can start to do stuff like that. You can do it across all apps. It's a terrific tool. So this is just the vuln feed. This is the NVD feed. I don't know why it stays stuck on the 18th, but it's actually getting updated every day. When I resort it, we should have up till like yesterday. This is running the non-enterprise version of the database backend, so it's a little slow, but that's okay. It's accessible. Yeah, so we see up through 7 December. Here's all the latest stuff coming out. Here's all the licenses they have, and they also provide this idea of license groups, which makes it easy to write a policy. So you can see, like, I wrote a policy here that says I can't have copied left. Now, whether or not that makes sense would really depend on if I'm scanning stuff that I'm producing versus stuff that I'm consuming. So I would probably add a tag to this that says it's internal for this policy to work, something like that, versus third-party stuff this wouldn't apply to. We don't care if they're using GPL. It doesn't impact us until we base new code off of it or something like that. So hopefully that gives everybody a glimpse of what an actual SBOM looks like, what your OWASP tool looks like. Hopefully we've covered a lot of what we think the benefits are, but also, what the challenges are. It's not like we can just flip a switch and this is all going to work great. It's going to take the community to really adopt it, and hopefully that's coming our way.
Awesome. So level of effort to, again, what departments use this? So if you just could mention that.
Well,
again.
let me answer Wendy's question.